The crisp Saturday morning air, thick with the smells of pine and fresh-cut grass, buzzed with children's laughter in Pittsburgh's Frick Park. A black luxury SUV, windows darkly tinted, slid to a discreet halt amongst the carefree families, drawing curious glances from the nannies pushing their high-end strollers. Richard Castellini emerged, his impeccably tailored suit a stark contrast to the other parents' casual weekend wear. He radiated authority, needing no words to command respect, his eyes sweeping the area before allowing his 4-year-old daughter, Penny, to clamber out of her car seat. "Daddy, can I go to the swings?" Penny asked, her bright eyes sparkling with the kind of pure joy that was a world away from the cold calculation that usually resided in her father's gaze. The man who ruled Pittsburgh's underworld with an iron fist seemed to soften visibly around his daughter, his last living link to the wife he'd adored. "Stay where I can see you, princess," Richard instructed, his deep voice holding a gentleness reserved only for her ears. He watched her skip toward the playground, her golden curls bouncing in the sunlight, while his bodyguards quietly took up strategic positions around the park's perimeter. Richard settled onto a bench, maintaining the careful distance that set him apart from ordinary people, his phone buzzing constantly with business that couldn't wait, even on a Saturday morning. The empire never slept, and neither did the responsibilities that came with being the most feared man in western Pennsylvania. Penny's delighted squeal pulled his attention from a particularly troubling message about a shipment at the docks. She'd abandoned the swings and was now chatting away with a young woman sitting alone near the playground's edge. The woman's simple dress and worn shoes marked her as belonging to a different world entirely. Something about her posture, a quiet dignity that shone through her obvious financial struggles, made Richard rise from the bench, a strange unease settling in his chest. Before he could signal his men, Penny was already dragging the blonde stranger toward him, her face alight with excitement. "Daddy, this is Miss Heather. She knows Mommy," Penny announced, oblivious to the chill her innocent words sent through her father. Richard's body tensed as he took in the slender woman standing before him, her clear gray-blue eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. "Mr. Castellini," she said softly, a flash of recognition crossing her face as she instinctively took a step back. "I didn't realize who she was until she mentioned her mother's name. I used to be your wife's nurse during her final days at Mercy Hospital." Richard felt the world tilt slightly beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes as memories crashed over him. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the constant beeping of machines, his wife's weakening voice. "Security check," he murmured into his cuff, watching as his men instantly moved to surround them. "I don't want any trouble," Heather said quickly, her eyes flicking to the approaching men in dark suits. "Your daughter came up to me, and I just recognized her from Catherine's photos. She has her mother's smile." The sound of his wife's name on the stranger's lips made Richard's jaw clench so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He studied her face, searching for any hint of deception, but finding only a nervous sincerity that somehow pierced the armor he'd built up around himself since Catherine's death. "Miss Heather told me she used to read stories to Mommy when she was sick," Penny piped up, swinging the woman's hand back and forth, unaware of the tense atmosphere between the adults. "She knows the penguin story Mommy used to tell me." Richard motioned for his head of security to stand down, his mind racing through the possibilities and the threats. "How long did you work with my wife?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions threatening to break free. 6 months, on the oncology floor," Heather replied, her gaze steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I was there until the end, until she asked me to deliver something to you. But when I came to your house afterward, your security wouldn't let me near you." Richard's world narrowed to this woman's face, the park around them fading into a blur as his heart hammered in his chest. "What did she ask you to deliver?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that would send his business rivals running for cover. "Not here," Heather replied, glancing meaningfully at Penny, who was now crouching to examine a ladybug crawling across the pavement. "It's been 2 years, and I've tried contacting you through proper channels. Your people always blocked me." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees overhead, bringing back memories of another October, when Catherine had first received her diagnosis. Richard studied the woman before him, plainly dressed, but with a strength in her posture that was painfully reminiscent of his late wife. "Daddy, can Miss Heather come have ice cream with us?" Penny asked, tugging at Richard's hand and breaking the tense silence. "She told me she likes strawberry, just like Mommy did." Richard looked at Heather's face again, noticing the slight shadows under her eyes and the worn edges of her cardigan. "My driver will take you to Riverside Cafe in 1 hour," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have a shift at the diner in 2 hours," Heather responded, surprising him with her directness. "I can meet you there in 30 minutes, but I won't get into a car with your men. I'm not that trusting, Mr. Castellini." A surprised smile, the first genuine one in months, almost cracked Richard's carefully constructed facade. Few people dared to negotiate with him, and even fewer survived the attempt. 30 minutes at Riverside. Phil will watch you until then." As Heather walked away, Richard noticed the slight limp in her gait and the careful way she moved along the park path. "Run a complete background check," he muttered to his second-in-command. "I want to know everything about her by the time we sit down for coffee." Back in the SUV, Penny chattered excitedly about her new friend while Richard stared out the window, memories washing over him like a relentless tide. Catherine's final weeks had been a blur of specialists, experimental treatments, and finally the quiet acceptance that had broken something fundamental inside him. "Daddy, you look sad," Penny observed, her small hand patting his much larger one with the innocent compassion that both healed and wounded him. "Miss Heather said Mommy was very brave. Was she brave like the princesses in my stories?" Richard gathered his daughter in his arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Your mother was braver than any princess?" he whispered, allowing himself a rare moment of vulnerability as they drove through Pittsburgh's autumn-painted streets. Through the tinted windows, Richard watched the city he controlled, the businesses that paid for protection, the politicians who turned a blind eye, the empire he'd built through violence and strategic alliances. None of it had saved Catherine from the cancer that had taken her life. "Sir, we have preliminary information on Heather Bennett," his security chief announced from the front seat. "Former oncology nurse at Mercy Hospital, left shortly after Mrs. Castellini's passing. Currently works 2 jobs, morning shifts at Steel City Diner and evenings at a nursing home in Bloomfield." Richard absorbed this information, feeling a flicker of curiosity replacing his initial suspicion. "Financial status?" he asked, already guessing the answer from her worn clothes and the way she'd spoken about her shift. "Significant medical debt of her own," came the reply. "Monthly treatments for a chronic condition, rheumatoid arthritis diagnosed 3 years ago. Lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Lawrenceville. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket." The Riverside Cafe sat nestled against the Allegheny River, its outdoor patio offering stunning views of the Pittsburgh skyline and enough privacy for sensitive conversations. Richard arrived exactly on time, having dropped Penny off with her nanny with a promise that she wouldn't mention their new friend to anyone. Heather was already at a corner table, her back to the wall with a clear view of all the entrances, a choice that suggested she was more aware of her surroundings than most people. She was wearing the same simple outfit she'd worn in the park, her blonde hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. "You've got 3 of your men watching us right now," she observed without preamble as Richard took the seat across from her. "One by the entrance, one pretending to read near the river, and one who followed me from the park. Bit of an overkill for a conversation with a nurse, don't you think?" Richard gave the hovering waiter a subtle nod, waiting until 2 coffees were delivered and the staff had retreated out of earshot. "In my position, caution isn't overkill. It's survival. Now, tell me what my wife wanted you to deliver." Heather wrapped her slender fingers around her coffee cup, drawing strength from its warmth. "During her last week, when you were dealing with that situation in Cleveland, Catherine gave me a sealed envelope and made me promise to deliver it personally to you after she was gone." The mention of Cleveland sent a chill through Richard's veins. The bloody territory dispute that had pulled him away during Catherine's final days remained his deepest regret. "Why didn't you mail it? Why try to see me in person?" Because she made me promise to see your face when you received it, Heather replied, her gaze unwavering despite the intimidating presence of the man across from her. She said some things can't be trusted to the postal service or intermediaries, especially in your line of work. Richard's expression remained impassive, though inwardly he admired her courage. And what exactly do you know about my line of work, Miss Bennet? He asked, his tone casual despite the dangerous undertones. I know enough to be careful, she answered simply, placing her coffee cup down with steady hands. I worked in hospice care before oncology. You learn to read people quickly in that job, to see past facades and understand what lies beneath. A strange feeling of exposure washed over Richard, as if this woman could somehow see through the armor he'd built up over years of climbing the ranks of Pittsburgh's criminal underworld. So, what happened to this envelope after my security turned you away? I kept it safe, Heather said, slowly reaching into her bag and pulling out a cream-colored envelope, its edges slightly worn but the seal unbroken. I tried several times to deliver it, but after the third attempt, and an implicit threat from your men, I decided to wait for fate to intervene. Richard stared at the envelope resting on the table between them, Catherine's elegant handwriting spelling out his name on the front. And you never opened it? Never got curious enough to peek at my wife's final words? Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, Heather responded, a flash of genuine offense crossing her face. Catherine trusted me. In my profession, trust is sacred, especially the trust of someone facing their final moments. Richard's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for the envelope, a reaction no business rival had ever witnessed. The paper felt impossibly heavy in his hands, carrying the weight of words his wife had intended him to read 2 years earlier. Would you like some privacy? Heather asked, already rising from her chair, showing a compassion rarely seen in Richard's world of power plays and hidden agendas. Her understanding of the gravity of the moment touched something long dormant in his chest. With a quick shake of his head, Richard broke the seal and unfolded a single page covered in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. The first words, "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, I've finally convinced someone to breach your fortress," brought a painful constriction to his throat. As his eyes moved across the page, Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. Catherine described discoveries she'd made about his business partner, Paul Harrington, during her final months. Financial documents accidentally delivered to their house. Hushed phone conversations overheard during Paul's hospital visits. She knew, Richard whispered, looking up at Heather with new understanding dawning in his eyes. She discovered Paul was embezzling from our legitimate businesses and making deals with the Cortese family behind my back. Heather nodded solemnly, finally sitting back down. She found out when one of her specialists mentioned seeing Paul meeting with known Cortese associates at a restaurant in Philadelphia. She was worried it would put you and Penny in danger. The letter went on to detail where Catherine had hidden evidence. Flash drives tucked inside hollowed-out books in their library, account numbers written in invisible ink on the backs of family photographs, recordings saved under innocent file names on her personal laptop. There's more, Heather said softly, reaching into her bag again and pulling out a small silver flash drive. This contains medical records that were altered after Catherine's death. Her oncologist, Dr. Marshall, had connections to the Cortese family, too. Richard's mind raced, making connections Catherine had already mapped out for him in her letter. They accelerated her treatments, pushed for more aggressive options when she was already too weak, he said, the truth becoming horribly clear. I noticed inconsistencies in her charts, Heather confirmed, her professional demeanor momentarily replaced by old anger. Medication dosages that didn't match orders, treatment schedules that contradicted standard protocols. When I raised concerns, I was transferred to another floor. Richard carefully folded the letter, his grief turning into something cold and focused as the pieces of a puzzle 2 years in the making fell into place. They wanted her gone because she knew too much. They used her illness as cover. Catherine suspected as much, Heather replied, her voice barely above a whisper. That's why she made me promise to get this to you personally. She was afraid the wrong people would intercept it, afraid you wouldn't believe it from anyone else. The cafe's noise faded as Richard processed this. Every business decision, every strange coincidence since Catherine's death, now looked sinister. Why did you wait so long? 2 years have passed. I tried for 6 months, Heather answered, defensive heat coloring her cheeks. Your security chief, Sanders, threatened to have me arrested for harassment. Then my arthritis diagnosis came, and survival became my priority. Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming message, an alert about unusual activity at his downtown office. Paul's making his move, he murmured, the pieces falling into place with terrifying speed. He must have seen us together and panicked. 2 days later, Heather stood nervously at the wrought iron gates of the Castellini estate, an imposing Georgian mansion in Pittsburgh's exclusive Shadyside neighborhood. The formal invitation delivered to her apartment felt surreal, an elaborate card asking her to Sunday dinner, signed by Richard himself. Miss Bennett, the security guard said, opening the passenger door for her after thoroughly checking the taxi. Mr. Castellini is expecting you. Please follow me to the main house. The manicured grounds stretched before her in autumn splendor, maple trees blazing red and gold against the backdrop of the stone mansion. Heather felt out of place in her simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, as she walked toward the entrance, where Richard waited. Thank you for coming, he said formally, though something warmer than their previous encounter flickered in his eyes. Penny hasn't stopped talking about you since the park. She'll be thrilled you accepted our invitation. The mansion's interior revealed tasteful luxury. Hardwood floors, original artwork, family photographs carefully arranged to suggest a normal, if wealthy, household. There was no visible trace of Richard's empire in this space. Miss Heather, Penny squealed, racing down the grand staircase in a pink dress, clutching a stuffed penguin. Daddy said you were coming. Did you bring the special book you told me about? Heather smiled, kneeling to the child's level despite her aching joints. I did. Your mom's favorite poetry book. Would you like to see it after dinner? As they moved to the dining room, Heather noticed subtle security measures throughout the house. Strategically placed cameras, reinforced windows, staff members who carried themselves like trained professionals. I've made some discoveries since our meeting, Richard said once Penny was distracted by the housekeeper. You were right about Dr. Marshall. He disappeared yesterday, emptied his bank accounts, and abandoned his practice without notice. Heather nodded, unsurprised. Catherine had said he always seemed nervous, checking his phone, rushing through exams. Paul hasn't shown up at the office either, Richard continued, his voice conversational despite the lethal intent beneath his words. But I've frozen all his accounts and recovered Catherine's evidence. The dinner proceeded surprisingly normally, with a delicious meal served on fine china, Penny's chatter, and reminiscences about Catherine that brought both pain and comfort. Would you read to me from Mommy's book now? Penny asked as dessert was cleared, her innocent request bridging the adults' different worlds. Daddy says you did special voices like Mommy. In the library, surrounded by leather-bound books and lavender candles, Heather opened the poetry book. This was the poem your mother asked for most often during our quiet evenings. Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching his daughter curl against the stranger who carried pieces of Catherine he'd been denied. The sight awakened gratitude, jealousy, and something more complex. You've taken a significant risk coming here, Richard said later after Penny was in bed. Paul has connections. If he knows you're the link, you're in danger. Heather met his gaze, the warm light softening her face. I've lived with that risk for 2 years, Mr. Castellini. Catherine's truth was worth it. The first attempt came 3 days later. A car accelerated suddenly as Heather crossed the street after her morning shift. Richard's man saved her. You can't go back to your apartment, Richard insisted that evening, pacing the safe house. Paul's desperate. Heather sat at the table, arms wrapped around herself. I have patients counting on me. I can't disappear. Richard stopped, struck by her concern. Sanders will arrange temporary coverage. A family emergency. Your job will be waiting. The safe house was comfortable, a step above her apartment. Fresh flowers stood in vases. We've connected Paul to over 30 million in embezzled funds, Richard explained, pouring wine. But the evidence linking him to Catherine's treatment remains circumstantial. Heather took the glass. The altered records should help, especially if we find Dr. Marshall. My sources say Marshall fled to Canada, Richard said, settling into a chair. But he left communications with Paul encrypted, but my team is working on it. As days passed, an unexpected routine developed. Richard arrived with updates and dinner, Penny visited on weekends, and Heather shared stories of Catherine's final months. She never lost her spirit, Heather recounted one evening. Even on her worst days, she wore her scarves and lipstick. Richard smiled. Catherine so perfectly captured. It made his chest ache. She wore red lipstick on our first date. Said a woman should always make a statement. I knew that night. The unspoken weight hung in the air. She worried about you and Penny, Heather said softly, redirecting the conversation. She made me promise to check that you were really living. 1 month into Heather's protective custody, Richard arrived tense. We've been betrayed from within, he announced, tossing a file onto the coffee table. Sanders has been working with Paul for years. Heather leaned forward, examining photographs of Richard's security chief meeting with Cortese Associates. Is this why your men kept me away after Catherine's death? Sanders was blocking Catherine's message. Not just blocking it, actively working to ensure Paul's plan succeeded, Richard confirmed. He's been feeding information to Paul. That night, Richard moved Heather to a converted warehouse in the Strip District, one of his organization's most secure facilities. No one knows about this place except my most trusted lieutenant. Frank, Richard explained. Not even Penny. Is my final fallback position. The significance wasn't lost on Heather. You're putting a lot of faith in someone you barely know. Catherine trusted you with her final message and our daughter's safety, Richard replied. In my world, that means more than years of acquaintance. Morning light streamed through the bulletproof windows, painting warm patterns on the polished concrete floors as Heather woke to the sounds of the warehouse district stirring to life. The scent of freshly brewed coffee led her to the kitchen, where Richard was studying documents spread across a steel countertop. We've located Marshall in Toronto, he announced without looking up, though Heather noticed a subtle shift in his posture when she entered. Frank's team is preparing to extract him. Voluntarily, if possible, but we'll get him regardless. Heather poured herself some coffee from an elaborate machine that required 3 attempts to operate correctly. If Sanders was compromised, how can you be sure about Frank? She asked. The question was born of genuine concern, not accusation. Richard finally looked up, dark circles under his eyes hinting that he hadn't slept at all. Frank was Catherine's cousin, the only family member who stood by her when she married me. His loyalty isn't to my business, it's to our family. The days blurred into a strange routine as Heather and Richard worked together to compile evidence against Paul and his network. Her medical expertise proved invaluable in deciphering treatment irregularities buried in Catherine's records, while Richard's resources provided access to financial trails that ordinary law enforcement would never uncover. You never asked what kind of business I actually run, Richard observed one evening as they shared takeout from a nearby Thai restaurant. Most people make assumptions based on rumors and newspaper headlines. Heather set down her chopsticks, considering her words carefully. Catherine told me enough to understand the complexity of your position. She paused. She said your legitimate businesses employed hundreds of Pittsburgh families who would otherwise struggle. The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant street sounds filtering through the reinforced walls. And the illegitimate ones? Richard asked, a challenge in his voice that suggested her answer mattered more than she might realize. Those were never my concern, Heather replied honestly, meeting his gaze without flinching. I'm a nurse. I've treated gunshot victims and overdoses without asking how they happened. My job is healing, not judgment. Richard's laugh, the first genuine one she'd heard from him, filled the space between them with unexpected warmth. Catherine said almost exactly the same thing the night I told her the truth about my family business. She had a healer's heart, too. On the 7th night in the warehouse, Penny arrived with Frank for a surprise visit, bringing homemade cookies and a hand-drawn picture depicting 3 stick figures. One tall with black hair, one small with yellow pigtails, and one medium with yellow hair labeled, Miss Heather. Daddy says we need to be extra careful right now, but I missed you, Penny explained, climbing onto Heather's lap with the uninhibited trust of childhood. I brought Penguin, too. He gets scared when there are bad guys around. Watching his daughter curl trustingly against Heather, Richard felt something shift inside him. A space long frozen beginning to thaw, despite his efforts to maintain emotional distance. The 3 of them formed a tableau he'd never imagined possible after Catherine's death. If I still love Mommy in heaven, but also like Miss Heather here, is that bad? Penny asked later that night as Richard tucked her into the guest bedroom prepared for her visit. The innocent question knocked the breath from his lungs more effectively than any physical blow. 3 days later, Marshall arrived in Pittsburgh under heavy guard, his once confident demeanor replaced by the haunted look of a man who had fled but couldn't escape his conscience. His hands trembled visibly as Frank escorted him into the warehouse's secure conference room. I never wanted to harm her, were his first words to Richard, spoken with the desperation of someone who had rehearsed justifications during sleepless nights. They threatened my family, showed me photos of my children at school, my wife at her yoga studio. Richard remained perfectly still, his control absolute despite the rage coursing beneath his composed exterior. Yet you altered her medication, approved experimental treatments her body wasn't strong enough to handle, and falsified her final records. Once started, the confession poured from Marshall like a dam breaking. He detailed Paul's initial approach 3 years earlier, the gradual escalation from minor ethics violations to active participation in hastening Catherine's decline, and finally, the network of Cortese family connections that had infiltrated Richard's organization while he was distracted by personal grief. Sign this, Richard instructed, sliding a notarized affidavit across the table detailing everything Marshall had just revealed. Then you'll be escorted to the FBI field office, where an agent who owes me a favor is expecting your voluntary surrender. Heather watched this exchange from the doorway, medical files clutched to her chest as evidence to supplement Marshall's testimony. The statute of limitations hasn't expired for medical malpractice resulting in death, she added, her professional knowledge adding weight to Richard's implied threat. With Marshall secured in federal custody and Sanders under surveillance by Richard's loyal men, the final pieces of their strategy fell into place. Evidence packages were prepared for delivery to 3 separate destinations: the FBI, the district attorney's office, and a trusted journalist at the Pittsburgh Tribune. Paul will be expecting us to move against him directly, Richard explained to Heather as they finalized preparations in the warehouse. He doesn't understand that Catherine taught me the value of working within the system when possible. The legitimate authorities will do our work for us. Early the following morning, simultaneous raids struck across Pittsburgh. Federal agents swarmed Paul's lakeside mansion. Local police executed search warrants at his downtown offices, and Interpol representatives froze accounts in 3 different countries. Richard watched the news coverage from the warehouse, his expression unreadable as cameras captured Paul being escorted to a waiting police vehicle. 2 years, he murmured, his voice barely audible. 2 years she's been gone while he walked free, building his power at my expense. Heather stood beside him, close enough to offer support without intruding on his moment of vindication. Catherine would be proud of how you handled this, she said. Choosing justice over vengeance, protecting Penny from the fallout, building a case that will stand in court. The warehouse's industrial silence was broken by the soft ping of Heather's phone. A message from her former supervisor at the nursing home checking on her unexpected leave of absence. This small reminder of her regular life felt surreal against the backdrop of federal raids and criminal conspiracies that had become her daily reality. There will be questions about your involvement when this becomes public, Richard said, his tactical mind already working through the aftermath. I've arranged for legal representation and prepared a statement that protects your reputation while acknowledging your role in bringing Catherine's case to light. Outside, a light rain began to fall on Pittsburgh's steel-gray rivers, the water carrying reflections of city lights that blurred and reformed with each droplet. Much like the identities they had both navigated during these weeks together, neither fully who they were before, nor entirely transformed. The media frenzy surrounding Paul's arrest dominated Pittsburgh news cycles for days, with headlines proclaiming corporate conspiracy led to socialite's death and medical murder plot uncovered. Through it all, Richard's name remained conspicuously absent, the result of strategic influence and carefully cultivated relationships with key officials. The Cortese family is retreating from Pittsburgh, Frank reported a week after the arrest. Their leadership understands this wasn't an attack on their territory, it was justice for Catherine. They're respecting the distinction. Richard nodded, satisfaction evident in his relaxed posture as he sat beside Penny in the mansion's garden, watching her feed the koi in Catherine's pond. And our legitimate businesses? Has the publicity affected operations? Stock prices actually rose after the announcement of Paul's arrest. Frank replied with a small smile. The board is impressed with how cleanly you excised the corruption. They're voting tomorrow on your proposal to expand the charitable foundation in Catherine's name. As security concerns diminished, Heather prepared to return to her apartment and resume her nursing duties, packing the few belongings that had migrated to the warehouse during her weeks under Richard's protection. The prospect of returning to her solitary life felt strangely hollow after the intensity of recent events. Penny's asking when you'll visit next, Richard said from the doorway of the warehouse bedroom. His casual stance was belied by the intensity in his dark eyes. She's become quite attached to you. We both have. Autumn gave way to winter. Pittsburgh's hills and valleys transformed by the season's first snowfall into a landscape of pristine white that concealed the city's industrial edges. Heather stood at her apartment window, watching fat snowflakes drift past the glass while contemplating the invitation card in her hand. The Castellini family requests your presence at the dedication of the Catherine Castellini Memorial Wing at Mercy Hospital. Read the elegant script, followed by details of the ceremony scheduled for the following weekend. The formal invitation was accompanied by a handwritten note in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Penny and I would be honored by your attendance. The hospital's main lobby had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with Catherine's favorite winter roses and photographs chronicling her life of philanthropy before illness claimed her. Healthcare professionals mingled with Pittsburgh's elite, unified by the common purpose of celebrating a life that had touched many. You look beautiful, Richard whispered as he approached Heather, his genuine appreciation for her simple blue dress warming her cheeks despite the December chill seeping through the hospital's massive windows. Catherine would have approved of your choice. She always said that color brought out your eyes. Penny danced between them, resplendent in a party dress and clearly enjoying her role as unofficial hostess. Miss Heather, Daddy says you might come live with us soon. Is that true? Could you read me stories every night like Mommy used to? Richard's eyes widened at his daughter's innocent disclosure of conversations not meant for public revelation. Penny, remember what we discussed about some things being private? He gently reminded her, though the affectionate exasperation in his tone contained no real reproach. The dedication ceremony proceeded with dignified simplicity. Richard's speech focused on Catherine's passion for ensuring quality health care for all Pittsburgh residents, regardless of financial status. The new wing would provide specialized oncology treatment for patients without insurance, funded in perpetuity by the Castellini Foundation. This isn't just about honoring her memory, Richard concluded, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. It's about continuing her work, transforming pain into purpose, and ensuring that other families have the resources we lacked during her battle. As applause filled the atrium, Heather felt a small hand slip into hers, Penny standing beside her with complete trust, forming a connection that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. The child's innocent acceptance had bridged worlds that might otherwise never have intersected. Later that evening, as guests mingled during the reception, Richard guided Heather to a quiet corner of the garden atrium, where Catherine's favorite orchids bloomed despite the snow piling against the windows outside. There's something I've been wanting to show you, he said, withdrawing an envelope from his inner pocket. Inside lay a photograph Heather had never seen. Catherine sitting up in her hospital bed, smiling despite obvious pain, with a younger Heather visible in the background, adjusting in 4-pump. She mentioned you in her journal almost every day during those final months, Richard explained softly. The kind nurse with sad eyes who deserves her own happiness someday. He read from a small leather-bound journal, Catherine's handwriting gracing the pages he turned with reverent care. She reminds me of myself before I met Richard, dedicated to helping others while forgetting to live her own life. Heather blinked back unexpected tears, touched by Catherine's perception and the strange twist of fate that had brought her into the orbit of the family her former patient had loved so fiercely. She was remarkably perceptive even when suffering. Most patients turn inward, but she remained connected to everyone around her. Richard closed the journal carefully, his next words chosen with deliberate precision. Catherine's last entry mentioned you specifically, said if anything happened to her, she hoped you might help remind me that life continues even after devastating loss. It seems she saw possibilities I wasn't ready to imagine. A distant piano began playing somewhere in the reception hall, the familiar notes of Catherine's favorite Chopin nocturne drifting through the atrium. She requested this piece for Penny's dance recital, Richard explained. The music bridged past and present as smoothly as the melting snow outside transformed winter into the promise of spring. Heather recognized the melody from hospital nights when Catherine, unable to sleep through pain, would hum it softly while describing the ballet classes she hoped Penny would continue even after she was gone. The memory crystallized the extraordinary connection between these three lives. One departed but still guiding, two present but still finding their way forward. I kept my nursing license current, Heather said unexpectedly, her professional commitment suddenly relevant to personal possibilities. The Foundation's new oncology wing will need experienced staff who understand both medical protocols and the emotional landscape patients navigate. Someone who remembers to treat the person, not just the disease. Snow continued falling beyond the glass walls of the atrium, creating a peaceful backdrop as Pittsburgh's lights twinkled through the winter night. Penny adores you, Richard continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. And I found myself looking forward to your visits more than I thought possible after Catherine. Are you certain? Heather asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate conversation. Your world is complex, dangerous at times. My life has always been simple by comparison, early shifts and comfortable routines. Richard's smile held a warmth few people ever witnessed, the private expression of a man accustomed to hiding his true self from the world. Catherine once told me that complicated men need the balance of straightforward women. She would have approved of how directly you challenge my assumptions. The dedication reception continued around them, but they remained in their quiet corner, discussing possibilities neither had anticipated when they first met in Frick Park months earlier. No definitive decisions were made that evening. Yet something had shifted, permission granted by Catherine's own words to explore connections that honored rather than diminished her memory. Spring arrived in Pittsburgh with characteristic unpredictability, snow giving way to delicate blossoms almost overnight as the city emerged from winter's grip. The three of them, Richard, Penny, and Heather, stood at Catherine's graveside, placing fresh flowers beside the elegant headstone that marked her final resting place. Mommy would be happy we're all together, Penny declared with childish certainty, her hand firmly clasped in Heather's as butterflies danced among nearby flowering bushes. I told her all about you when Daddy wasn't listening. Richard knelt beside his daughter, straightening the colorful drawing she had propped against the stone. What exactly did you tell her? He asked gently, his tone suggesting this was a familiar conversation rather than a disturbing one. That Miss Heather makes you smile again. Penny replied simply, the truth of childhood cutting through adult complexities. And that her heart has lots of rooms too. One for her patients, one for me, one for you, and still plenty of room for Mommy, too. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is important for me to continue creating content.